In the vast expanse of the American frontier, legends were born in whispers and forged in gunsmoke. But few tales commanded more respect than that of Sheriff Thomas "Deadeye" Davidson, a man whose weathered face and graying temples concealed a past written in lead and gunpowder. They say, when the notorious Crimson Riders threatened to paint his town red, they had no idea they were challenging the very man who had once brought down the deadliest outlaw confederation in Wyoming territory. Some men wear a star to uphold the law, others wear it to bury their ghosts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thunder Valley, Montana Territory, 1878, stood as a testament to mankind's relentless push westward. What had begun as a modest copper mining camp had blossomed into a thriving settlement, its neat rows of wooden buildings and wide streets speaking to the ambitious vision of its inhabitants. But it was the man who maintained order in this growing frontier town who truly set Thunder Valley apart. Sheriff Thomas Davidson, whose silver-streaked hair and lined face belied a vitality that younger men had learned to respect, had served as the town's guardian for the past 7 years. To most residents, Davidson was simply the old lawman, a steady presence who preferred to settle disputes with stern wisdom rather than steel. His most distinguishing features were the black patch he wore over his left eye, allegedly lost to a mining accident years ago, and the perfectly maintained Remington 1875 that rode low on his hip in a well-worn holster. Mary Sullivan, the town's doctor who tended to the sheriff's occasional bouts of rheumatism, glimpsed something more beneath his carefully maintained facade. The scars that mapped his body told a story at odds with his quiet demeanor, precise bullet wounds and knife marks that spoke of close-quarter combat, the kind of history that made her wonder about the weight behind his remaining eyes' steady gaze. "There's a difference between men who've learned to shoot and men who've learned to kill," she once confided to her friend Rebecca Cooper, who ran the town's general store. "The sheriff's eye. It carries the same haunted look I saw in expert marksmen during the war. There's a burden there that comes from never missing your target." Davidson's daily routine was as predictable as the town clock. He made his rounds at dawn and dusk, took his meals at Cooper's Cafe, and spent his evenings on the jail's porch, whittling wood with his good eye closed, seeming to rely more on touch than sight, while his remaining eye scanned the street with unwavering vigilance. His deputy, young William Harper, often remarked how the sheriff could spot trouble brewing before anyone else, as if his missing eye had heightened his other senses to an almost supernatural degree. The town's children viewed him with a mixture of awe and affection. He always had time to help a lost child or share a story from his seemingly endless collection of frontier tales. But even they sensed something different about him, especially in the way he moved, silent as a mountain. Lion despite his age, their parents noticed too how he could appear seemingly out of nowhere when trouble threatened, his mere presence often enough to diffuse the most volatile situations. Davidson's reputation for fairness and steady judgment had helped Thunder Valley prosper. The copper mine's payroll moved through town without incident, cattle drives passed peacefully, and even the roughest elements seemed to respect the boundaries he set. Few connected this peace to the subtle signs, how drifters with hard eyes and gunfighters' calluses would quickly move on after a quiet word with the sheriff, or how traveling lawmen would straighten with recognition when they heard his name. The truth about Thomas Davidson lay buried in scattered whispers and yellowing wanted posters, in campfire tales of a legendary army sharpshooter whose accuracy with a rifle was matched only by his relentless efficiency in hunting down those who preyed on the innocent. They spoke of a man called Deadeye Davidson, who had spent a decade after the war as a government marksman, hunting the worst outlaws across the territories. His name alone was enough to make hardened killers choose different hunting grounds, but that was all in the past, or so the people of Thunder Valley believed. Their sheriff was just a weathered old lawman, content to end his days keeping peace. In a growing town, this illusion of tranquility was about to be shattered by the arrival of the Crimson Riders, a savage band of outlaws whose latest spree of bank robberies and murder had the entire territory on edge. As autumn painted the distant Bitterroot Mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Thunder Valley was about to discover that fate had given them more than just a sheriff. It had given them a guardian whose quiet demeanor masked a deadly accuracy that had never truly faded. The legend of Deadeye was about to rise again, and the Crimson Riders would learn why some reputations are earned one shot at a time. In the saloon, where tongues loosened by whiskey often spoke truth, old Samuel Hawkins, who'd served in the 2nd U.S. Sharpshooters during the war, would sometimes get a distant look in his eyes when asked about the sheriff. "Some men," he'd say, staring into his glass, "they're like well-oiled rifles. Look plain on the surface, but there's precision underneath that only shows when the target's in sight. Our sheriff, he's got depths most folks never see. Pray you never have to witness them." In the livery stable, where honest work often bred honest conversation, James "Smoky" Peters, the town's blacksmith, had his own observations about the sheriff. A veteran of countless frontier skirmishes himself, Peters had developed an eye for men who carried violence in their past. He'd watched Davidson during the quiet moments, noting how the sheriff's remaining eye would track moving targets with an unnatural smoothness, how his head would turn fractionally at the slightest unusual sound. "Way he moves," Peters confided to Deputy Harper one afternoon while shoeing the law officer's horses, "reminds me of the scout we had in the 4th Cavalry. Man could shoot the whiskers off a cat at 300 yards, but it wasn't just about accuracy. It was about reading the wind, knowing the terrain, and understanding how your target thinks. The sheriff's got that same way about him, like he's always calculating something we can't see." The copper mine's foreman, Michael Chen, had his own reasons to respect Davidson's capabilities. 3 months prior, when claim jumpers had threatened his workers, the sheriff had demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate their movements. He'd positioned himself on a ridge 1/2 mile from the mine entrance, and when the trouble started, 3 precisely placed warning shots had sent the would-be thieves fleeing, each bullet striking the ground exactly 1 foot in front of their horses, despite the gusty mountain winds. Distance wasn't natural, Chen maintained whenever the story came up. Sun was setting, the wind was swirling, but those shots, they were like something from one of those dime novel legends. Next day, I asked him about it, casual-like, all he said was, "Wind's just another thing you need to account for." Said it the same way most men might talk about checking their saddle cinch. The truth about Davidson's past surfaced in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle no one had fully assembled. Rebecca Cooper's teenage son, Timothy, who helped sort mail at the post office, once glimpsed a letter addressed to the sheriff from the War Department, bearing the seal of the Army's Special Target Division. The boy noticed how Davidson's hand had trembled slightly when accepting it, his good eye distant with memories. Even the sheriff's small habits spoke to hidden depths. He maintained a curious ritual of measuring distances around town in precise increments, pacing off key locations during his morning rounds. He kept a small notebook filled with cryptic numbers and wind calculations, though he claimed it was just a log of town events. And most tellingly, he spent one Sunday each month at the old quarry outside town, though few knew he used those hours to maintain his shooting skills, keeping his accuracy razor-sharp, despite his advanced years. The stage was set for a confrontation that would strip away pretense and reveal the deadly truth behind the badge. Thunder Valley was about to learn that some men don't age. They just get more accurate with time. The precision that had made Thomas "Deadeye" Davidson a legend was about to be tested against brutal force, and the outcome would write a new chapter in the history of the American frontier. The first signs of the approaching storm arrived with the evening stage. Carried in the haunted eyes of a young banker from Copper Creek, Sheriff Davidson was making his evening rounds when the coach thundered into town, its horses lathered and blew hard, the driver pushing them well beyond their usual pace. The banker, Frederick Morton, practically fell from the coach, his fine eastern suit covered in dust and his face ashen with terror. Within minutes, Davidson had him settled in his office, a cup of strong coffee warming his trembling hands. The story spilled out between shaky sips. The Crimson Riders had struck again, this time hitting the Copper Creek Bank in broad daylight. But it wasn't just the robbery that had Morton rattled. It was the calculated precision of their methods. They didn't just take the money, Morton explained, his voice barely above a whisper. They made examples. Their leader, Victor "Red" Hawthorne, he had his men shoot out the knees of our security guard from exactly 50 paces, said it was a message, said every town from here to the Canadian border would learn to respect true marksmanship. The banker's hands shook, sloshing coffee. Onto his sleeve, "They're not just outlaws, Sheriff, they're hunters." Deputy Harper, listening from his desk, saw something change in Davidson's expression. Subtle, like the first shadow of a storm cloud passing over a mountain peak. The sheriff's questions came measured and precise, each one drawing out specific details about the gang's shooting patterns, their preferred ranges, their methods of target selection. These weren't the usual queries of a small-town lawman. They were the calculated assessments of a marksman studying potential opponents. Dr. Sullivan, arriving to check on the banker's condition, caught the tail end of the conversation. She noticed how the sheriff's hand kept brushing the grip of his Remington, an unconscious gesture that spoke of ingrained habits. More telling was how he stood. No longer the slightly stooped posture of an aging lawman, but the balanced stance of a man, ready to respond to threats from any angle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Later that evening, Cooper's Cafe became the center of town speculation. News of the Copper Creek robbery spread quickly, carried on whispers of fear and speculation. The details grew with each retelling. How the Crimson Riders had grown to over 24 expert marksmen, how they left a trail of precisely placed bullets and broken lives across 3 territories, how even the territorial marshals hesitated to pursue them. They say Red Hawthorne learned his trade in the war, Samuel Hawkins shared over coffee, his voice carrying the weight of military experience. Served as a sniper in the Confederate Army, made his reputation picking off officers. At extreme ranges, he's only gotten better since then. The old sharpshooter's eyes drifted to where Sheriff Davidson sat, at his usual table, seemingly absorbed in his evening meal. "Might be time to send for help, Sheriff. No shame in admitting when trouble's too big for one man." Davidson's response was characteristically brief, but there was something in his tone that made Hawkins study him more closely. "Town's got a sheriff. That's enough help." The words carried a hint of steel that reminded the veteran of other men he'd known, men whose quiet words carried deadly promise. As night settled over Thunder Valley, more details emerged about the Crimson Riders' pattern. They'd hit 4 towns in the past month, each robbery marked by demonstrations of their shooting prowess. Their reputation had grown, attracting skilled marksmen from across the territories. Former soldiers, professional hunters, and competitive shooters drawn by Hawthorne's growing legend of deadly accuracy. In his office, Davidson spent the evening reviewing wanted posters by lamplight, his remaining eye tracing the reported shooting patterns on a territorial map. Deputy Harper, watching his mentor work, noticed how the sheriff lingered over one particular poster, a sketch of Red Hawthorne himself, with a list of confirmed long-distance kills beneath it. "Have you ever run into any of Hawthorne's crew before?" Harper ventured to ask. The question hung in the air for a long moment before Davidson responded, his voice carrying an edge the deputy had never heard before. "Long time ago," the sheriff said quietly, "back in Virginia during the war, before he called himself Red, back when he served under a man named Colonel Sebastian Wade in the Confederate Sharpshooter Corps." The name seemed to carry special weight, though Harper didn't recognize it. Wade taught him everything he knows about precision shooting, taught him too well. The deputy wanted to ask more, but something in Davidson's expression warned against it. Instead, he watched as the sheriff stood and walked to the gun cabinet, removing a long-barreled Sharps rifle with methodical precision. Davidson began to clean the weapon, his movement speaking of years of practice. The eye patch came off for this task, and in the lamplight, Harper caught a glimpse of what it usually hid. Not a mining accident's aftermath as rumored, but a precise bullet scar that had barely missed taking his life. Out in the gathering, darkness, Thunder Valley settled in for what many feared might be its last peaceful night. Unknown to them, their aging sheriff was preparing for a confrontation that would shake their understanding of the quiet man who had guarded their peace for 7 years. The star he wore had kept his past hidden, but soon it would serve as a target for men who didn't realize they were challenging a legend they thought long dead. As Davidson finished with the rifle and reached for his Remington, the lamplight caught his reflection in the office window. For a moment, Deputy Harper saw what others would soon discover, not the aged lawman of Thunder Valley, but the deadly specter of Deadeye Davidson, the man who had brought justice to the darkest corners of the frontier, one perfectly placed, shot at a time. The changes didn't go unnoticed by others in town. Michael Chen, making a late-night check on the mine's security, reported seeing lights in the sheriff's office well past midnight. Through the window, he glimpsed Davidson methodically arranging boxes of ammunition, each sorted by grain weight and powder load, the kind of precise preparation that spoke of expertise far beyond ordinary law enforcement. Even the town's most observant residents missed the significance of Davidson's other preparations. They didn't notice how he spent extra time studying the wind patterns in key locations throughout town, or how he paced off exact distances between buildings, marking them in his notebook with scientific precision. The sheriff was transforming Thunder Valley into a shooting gallery, but one designed for a very specific purpose. Rebecca Cooper, closing up her store for the night, caught sight of Davidson making an unusual detour during his final rounds. He climbed the church bell tower, spending nearly an hour in the high perch, his remaining eye scanning the surrounding landscape with methodical care. The next morning, she found small marks carved into the tower's wooden railings, precise angle measurements that meant nothing to her but would prove crucial in the days to come. Dr. Sullivan, making her own late rounds, observed other subtle changes. The sheriff had positioned spare rifles in strategic locations throughout town, behind the bar at the saloon, in the back room of Cooper's store, even one carefully hidden in her own clinic. Each weapon was meticulously maintained and sighted, in for specific distances, though few in town had the skill to use them effectively at such ranges. These preparations spoke to a level of tactical thinking that went far beyond standard law enforcement. Davidson wasn't just preparing for a confrontation, he was setting up a complex web of firing positions, each one carefully calculated to support the others. It was the work of a man who understood not just shooting, but the geometry of combat. At extreme ranges, James Peters, working late at his forge, noticed something else about Davidson's preparations that spoke to deeper planning. The sheriff had asked him to modify several ammunition cases with precise compartments, each marked with specific distances. "Need them organized just so," Davidson had explained, demonstrating exactly how he wanted the cartridges arranged. When the time comes, there won't be room for confusion about range and load. The blacksmith recognized the methodology behind the request. It was the same kind of precise organization he'd seen among elite sharpshooters during his military service. Each compartment was labeled with a specific distance, wind condition, and elevation adjustment. It was the work of a man who understood that in precision shooting, the smallest detail could mean the difference between life and death. The town's children, usually the first to notice unusual changes, reported their own observations to their parents. Young Tommy Cooper had seen the sheriff spending time at the highest points in town, making marks in his notebook while studying the surrounding landscape. Sarah Chen mentioned how Davidson had asked her detailed questions about the wind patterns near her father's mine, particularly how they changed throughout the day. These seemingly innocuous details painted a picture that few in Thunder Valley had yet pieced together. Their aging sheriff wasn't just preparing for a confrontation, he was transforming the entire town into an elaborate shooting range, with precisely measured distances, documented wind patterns, and carefully planned fields of fire. That night, as Thunder Valley slept under a star-filled Montana sky, Sheriff Thomas Davidson made one final preparation. In the privacy of his office, he opened a locked trunk that hadn't seen the light of day in 7 years. Inside lay the tools of his former trade, a custom-made distance gauge, wind meters, and most tellingly, a leather-bound journal filled with thousands of calculations for shots taken during the war and his years as a government marksman. As he closed the trunk, his remaining eye caught his reflection in the office window. The image that stared back wasn't the aging lawman Thunder Valley had come to know. It was Deadeye Davidson, the legendary marksman who had once made impossible shots seem routine. The Crimson Riders were about to learn that in the world of precision shooting, age meant nothing compared to experience, and some legends never miss their mark. Dawn painted Thunder Valley in shades of amber and gold, but Sheriff Davidson had been awake long before the sun created the Bitterroot Mountains. He stood on the jail's porch, watching the town come to life while his mind worked through the calculations of survival. 20 years of experience had taught him to read signs others missed, and everything pointed to trouble, riding toward Thunder Valley like an approaching storm. Dr. Sullivan, making her early morning rounds, paused at the sight of the sheriff's silhouette against the rising sun. Something had changed in his bearing overnight. The careful stoop of age had vanished, replaced by the straight-backed vigilance of a marksman assessing potential firing positions. When he turned to acknowledge her presence, she noticed his. We're constantly scanning the street, cataloging distances with military precision. Expecting trouble, Sheriff? She asked, though she already knew the answer. His response was characteristic in its brevity, but heavy with meaning. Trouble's already here, Doc, just waiting on the range to close. He adjusted his eye patch, a gesture she'd noticed became more frequent when violence loomed on the horizon. Hawthorne's not the kind to let the sun set twice once he picks his target. Throughout the morning, Davidson moved through town with deliberate purpose. He visited the livery stable, ensuring fresh horses were ready. He spoke with Rebecca Cooper about stockpiling supplies in her cellar. He had Deputy Harper inventory their ammunition, particularly paying attention to the special loads he'd had James Peters modify. Each action was measured, methodical, the movements of a man who had orchestrated such preparations many times before. The changes didn't go unnoticed. Samuel Hawkins, watching from his usual spot outside the saloon, recognized the pattern. He'd seen it before in the war, the way elite sharpshooters prepared their positions before a major engagement. See how he's marking ranges? He murmured to William Harper, pointing out the small notches Davidson was discreetly carving into various posts and railings. That ain't standard sheriff work. That's precision shooting preparation. He's turning the whole town into a calculated firing range. By midday, 3 strangers had ridden into town, trail-worn men with scoped rifles and the steady eyes of experienced marksmen. They claimed to be bounty hunters, but Davidson noted how they separated upon arrival, each taking up positions that offered clear views of the main street. He watched them through his office window, his hand resting near his Remington. "Scouts," he explained to Harper, his voice pitched low. "Hawthorne's men testing our defenses, counting guns, noting ranges, measuring winds." He paused, studying how the strangers interacted with townsfolk. "They'll report back that we're an easy target. 1 aging sheriff, 1 green deputy. That's exactly what we want them to think." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "Shouldn't we arrest them, run them out of town at least?" Davidson's response carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Sometimes the best shot is the one you set up long before you pull the trigger." As afternoon shadows lengthened, more subtle changes manifested in Thunder Valley. Frederick Morton, still shaken from his experience in Copper Creek, noticed how the sheriff had quietly organized the townspeople. Store owners began moving valuables to secure locations. Rebecca Cooper's usual dinner crowd found themselves seated away from windows. Even the children seemed to pick up on the tension, staying closer to home than usual. But it was Dr. Sullivan who witnessed the most telling transformation. Called to the jail to treat a prisoner's sprained wrist, she arrived to find Davidson, practicing at the back lot. His shooting exhibition was a revelation, precise shots that clustered in tight groups at varying ranges, each one accounting for the tricky mountain winds that swirled through the valley. When he noticed her watching, Davidson simply nodded and holstered his Remington. "Some skills," he said quietly. "You never really forget. Just keep them hidden until they're needed." She noticed he'd removed his eye patch, revealing not just the bullet scar she'd glimpsed before, but a focus and clarity that belied any suggestion of impaired vision. As evening approached, Harper overheard a conversation between Davidson and Samuel Hawkins that shed new light on their sheriff's past. Hawkins had brought news about Red Hawthorne's history, things he'd learned from his old military contacts. The name Colonel Sebastian Wade came up again, and this time the deputy caught more details. "Wade was a legend in the Confederate Sharpshooter Corps," Hawkins said, his voice low. "They say he trained a handful of men in his methods, taught them everything he knew about long-range shooting. Then something went wrong. Most of them turned bad, started using those skills for their own purposes." He studied Davidson's face, carefully. All except one. The one they called Deadeye, the one who hunted down his own brothers when they crossed the line. Davidson's response was lost in the evening breeze, but his expression spoke volumes. The weight of past decisions, of old loyalties betrayed and justice delivered, seemed to settle around his shoulders like his worn duster. The star on his chest caught the last rays of sunlight, a symbol not just of law, but of choices made and prices paid. That night, as Thunder Valley settled into an uneasy quiet, something fundamental had shifted. The 3 strangers rode out just before sunset, carrying their report back to Red Hawthorne. They would tell him about a seemingly vulnerable town, about an aging sheriff who wore an eye patch and moved stiffly. What they couldn't report was the deadly truth hiding behind that peaceful facade, that Thunder Valley's guardian was far more than he appeared, and that the Crimson Riders were riding toward a confrontation with a legend they thought long dead. The telegram arrived at dawn, its message stark in its brevity: Silver Springs hit, bank destroyed, 5 dead, shots all kill range, Crimson Riders headed north. Davidson read the words twice, his weathered face revealing nothing, but his hand tightened imperceptibly on the yellow paper. Deputy Harper, watching his mentor's reaction, noticed how the morning light caught old marks on the sheriff's neck. Powder burns by the look of them, long healed but never forgotten. Silver Springs lay just 3 days' ride south of Thunder Valley, and its destruction painted a clear picture of what awaited them. Throughout the morning, more details filtered in through stage drivers and travelers. The Crimson Riders had evolved. Their tactics, becoming more organized, more precise in their shootings, they demonstrated their marksmanship by picking off fleeing victims at extreme ranges, ensuring maximum terror. Red Hawthorne himself had stood in the street, making impossible shots while holding the town marshal's family hostage. "They're sending a message," Davidson explained to the town council gathered in an emergency session at Cooper's Cafe. "Each shot gets more difficult, more precise. Hawthorne's telling us what's coming." His voice remained steady, but those who knew him well caught the undertone of cold anger. "Silver Springs had twice our population, a proper police force. He's telling us distance, and numbers won't save us." Michael Chen, his face grim from the news, voiced what many were thinking. "Maybe we should send for the army. Fort Harrison's only 4 days' ride." The suggestion hung in the air like gunsmoke after a firefight, but Davidson's response cut through it with quiet authority. "Army won't get here in time. Besides," he adjusted his eye patch with deliberate care, "bringing in soldiers would just make Hawthorne prove his point faster. Man like that, he enjoys an audience for his work." The sheriff's words carried the weight of personal knowledge, though none present yet understood how deep that knowledge ran. Dr. Sullivan, studying Davidson's face during the meeting, noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. The careful facade of age had slipped further, revealing glimpses of the man beneath, a predator assessing his hunting ground with mathematical precision. When he outlined his defensive plans, his voice took on a tone of command that made even the most skeptical council members straighten in their chairs. Throughout the day, Thunder Valley transformed under Davidson's quiet direction. The bank's windows were reinforced, but more importantly, the sheriff had James Peters install specially marked brackets at precise intervals along the building's facade. To most, they appeared to be simple decorative additions. To a trained marksman, they were range markers, each one carefully calculated. Rebecca Cooper organized the town's women to prepare medical supplies and emergency rations, but under Davidson's guidance, their preparation went deeper. Each storage location was chosen not just for convenience, but for its precise position relative to key defensive points. The sheriff had transformed the town's very architecture into a complex firing solution. Samuel Hawkins, watching these preparations from his usual spot, shared insights with Deputy Harper about their significance. "Notice how he's setting it up," the old sharpshooter observed, pointing out subtle details others might miss. "Every position covers 3 different ranges. Each fallback point gives clear lines of sight to specific distances. That's not just defensive planning, that's a marksman's geometry." By afternoon, more strangers had ridden into town, different from the previous scouts. These men carried expensive target rifles with custom scopes, moving with the fluid confidence of professional shooters. They took rooms at the hotel, claiming to be passing through on their way to a shooting competition. Davidson let them stay, but positioned trusted townsmen to watch their movements. "Why not run them out?" Harper asked, cleaning his rifle as evening approached. The sheriff's response was measured, tactical. "They're here to gauge our shooting capacity, see if anyone in town can match their skill level." He paused, checking the sight alignment on his Remington. "Better to know where your competition is than to wonder about their range and elevation settings." As sunset painted the mountains copper and gold, Dr. Sullivan made a discovery that added new layers to the brewing conflict. Treating one of the stranger's minor injuries, she noticed a distinctive medal pinned inside his vest, the marksman's cross of Wade's Confederate sharpshooters. When she mentioned this to Davidson, his reaction was subtle but significant. "Wade marked all his best students," he said quietly, unconsciously touching his eye patch. "Believed in branding his best shots, one way or another." The bitter edge In his voice spoke of personal history, of old wounds that went deeper than flesh. For the first time, Sullivan understood the true significance of the eye patch. It wasn't hiding a wound, but erasing a past connection to Wade's elite cause of marksman. Night settled over Thunder Valley like a held breath. The visiting marksmen remained in their rooms, occasionally visible through lit windows, playing their roles while studying the town's layout. In his office, Davidson worked late, reviewing maps and old wanted posters. One yellow document caught Harper's attention, a faded photograph showing 5 men standing before a Confederate camp, each holding a precision rifle. Though younger, Davidson was clearly recognizable, standing next to a tall man with cold eyes who could only be Colonel Wade. "They called us the Shadow Corps," Davidson said, noticing Harper's interest. "Wade's special unit, trained for impossible shots at extreme ranges. We were good at it too. Too good. Power like that, the ability to deal death from distances others couldn't even see, it changes men." His voice carried the weight of bitter experience. Wade started seeing himself as an artist of death, started choosing targets based on the challenge rather than justice. The sheriff didn't finish the thought, but his meaning was clear. The eye patch moved unconsciously to the scar visible beneath it, the mark that had nearly taken his life. The deputy began to understand that the coming conflict was more than just a sheriff defending his town. It was the final act of a tragedy that had begun years ago under the Confederate flag. Outside, Thunder Valley's streets lay quiet under the stars. Tomorrow would bring violence, everyone could feel it in their bones. But tonight, they took comfort in knowing their aging sheriff was more than he appeared. None yet realized just how much more, or how personal the coming storm would become. The night brought an unexpected visitor to Thunder Valley, one who would shed new light on the brewing conflict. Dr. Sullivan was tending to her evening rounds when she noticed a rider approaching from the east, an elderly man wearing a weathered U.S. Marshal's badge, his bearing unmistakably military despite his advanced years. His right arm, held stiffly against his side, suggested an old wound that had never properly healed. Sheriff Davidson emerged from his office at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, his hand instinctively near his holstered Remington. His reaction to the visitor spoke volumes, a slight straightening of his posture, a barely perceptible nod of recognition. "Marshal Anderson," he said quietly. "Long ride from Fort Benton." The older man's response carried equal weight. "Some rides need making, Thomas, especially when Wade's ghosts start walking again." Inside the office, Deputy Harper observed the reunion of 2 men who had clearly shared history. Anderson removed his coat, revealing an intricate network of scars on his right arm, powder burns similar to those on Davidson's neck. The Marshal's arrival seemed to lift some invisible weight from the sheriff's shoulders, as if the presence of someone who understood his past made the burden easier to bear. Word reached Fort Benton about Hawthorne's movements, Anderson explained, accepting a cup of coffee from Harper. "When I heard he was heading for Thunder Valley, I knew it couldn't be coincidence. Wade trained us too well to believe in coincidences." He studied Davidson's face carefully. "How long have you been waiting for this, Thomas?" The sheriff's response was measured but heavy with meaning. 7 years since I heard what Hawthorne did to those settler families up in Dakota Territory, what Wade's teachings turned him into." He removed his eye patch, revealing not just the scar, but a gaze that matched Anderson's in its intensity. "Some debts can only be paid in lead." Anderson shared details that filled crucial gaps in the story. The Shadow Corps' descent into darkness hadn't been sudden, but a gradual corruption of purpose. Wade had started them as an elite unit of sharpshooters, but success had bred obsession, and obsession had led to perversion of their skills. "We were too good at what we did," Anderson explained. Wade began to see himself as an artist of death, and started treating each shot like a masterpiece. Began targeting anyone he deemed worthy of his expertise. The marshal's words painted a picture of how Wade had transformed a skilled marksman into something darker. He called it elevated purpose. Anderson continued, his voice bitter with memory. Said some men needed killing just to prove the art of the shot. Hawthorne was the first to fully embrace that philosophy and started treating each kill like a performance. Davidson listened silently, his hand absently tracing the well-worn grip of his Remington. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of held pain. Wade discovered I was gathering evidence against him, decided to make an example, had Hawthorne and the others try to execute me from 500 yards. His hand moved to the scar beneath his eye patch. Anderson found me, got me help in time. That's when we learned the true cost of Wade's teaching. The story that emerged through their conversation revealed layers of tragedy that went beyond simple outlawry. Hawthorne had taken Wade's lessons about precision and artistry to new extremes, turning them into a philosophy of performative violence. What he did in Silver Springs, Anderson explained, wasn't just about money. That was him proving he'd surpassed Wade, showing he could orchestrate death like a conductor leads a symphony. Dr. Sullivan, who had remained to tend to Anderson's old injury, noticed how the conversation seemed to age both men. They spoke of former brothers-in-arms who had chosen darkness over duty, of how Wade's teachings about precision had become perverted into exercises in cruelty. More telling were the details they didn't share, the names they wouldn't speak, suggesting wounds too deep for words. As midnight approached, Anderson shared intelligence about Hawthorne's growing force. He's gathered every skilled shot between here and the Canadian border, men who've heard the stories about Deadeye and want to prove themselves against the legend. He paused, studying his old friend. They don't know it's you, Thomas, Wade's last student, the one who never lost his soul to art. The revelation of Davidson's true identity as Wade's most gifted student added new dimensions to the coming conflict. Samuel Hawkins, invited to join the discussion for his tactical knowledge, understood the implications immediately. That's why your preparations looked so familiar, he said. You're using Wade's own methods against them. Same calculations, same precision, but in defense rather than assault. Deputy Harper, listening intently, began to see the larger picture. Every move Davidson had made since taking the badge in Thunder Valley had been preparation for this moment. He had chosen the ground, studied the angles, and waited patiently for the day when his past would demand a reckoning. The quiet lawman they had known was merely the surface of a much deeper, more dangerous man. The night deepened as the three veterans planned, their discussion ranging from tactics to old wounds, never fully healed. Anderson's presence brought not just additional firepower, but validation of Davidson's methods. Here was another man who understood the true nature of their opponent, who had seen firsthand how Wade's teachings could twist men's souls. Hawthorne will come at dawn, Davidson concluded, his voice carrying absolute certainty. Wade, always, taught that light conditions are most challenging at first light. He'll want to make a show of it, prove he's more than just another outlaw marksman. The sheriff's expression hardened. But Wade taught me something he never taught the others. Sometimes the best shot is the one your target never sees coming. As Anderson prepared to check the town's defenses, he shared one final piece of information that cast the coming battle in an even darker light. Wade's still out there, Thomas. Some say he's watching, waiting to see how his students measure up. The marshal's words hung in the air like gun smoke. This isn't just about Hawthorne anymore. It's about ending what started in Virginia all those years ago. The gravity of this revelation settled over the office like a shroud. Thunder Valley wasn't just facing a gang of skilled shooters, it was about to become the battleground for a conflict that had been brewing for years, a test of what happens when precision becomes perverted, and how far a man will go to right the wrongs of the past. As the night wore on, Anderson and Davidson fell into the familiar patterns of men who had spent years calculating shots together. They spoke in the specialized language of elite marksmen, discussing wind vectors, elevation adjustments, and minute angles that went far beyond normal shooting. "Remember that shot at Missionary Ridge?" Anderson asked, his weathered face thoughtful. "In lamplight, 1,000 yards crosswind uphill grade." Davidson nodded, his remaining eye distant with memory. Wade called it impossible, said no man could account for all the variables. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Prove him wrong that day. That's when he started seeing me differently." The marshal's expression darkened. "That's when he started pushing you harder than the others, trying to remake you in his image." He paused, studying the tactical map Davidson had marked with precise measurements. "He never understood that your gift wasn't just about calculating trajectories. It was about knowing when not to take the shot." James Peters, arriving late with modified ammunition cases, added his own perspective to the discussion. The blacksmith had served in a support role for sharpshooter units during the war, and he recognized the level of preparation going into Davidson's plans. "Never seen anything like your distance marking system," he commented, examining the sheriff's notebooks. "Most long-range men, they measure in yards, but you're accounting for angle, elevation, even air density." "Wade taught us the science," Davidson explained, checking the custom loads Peters had prepared. "Called it mathematical certainty, but he forgot that every shot has consequences beyond the target." His hand moved unconsciously to his eye patch. "Some lessons you learn the hard way." Dr. Sullivan, who had stayed to document Anderson's old injuries for her records, observed the interaction between the three veterans with professional interest. She noticed how they moved in concert, each understanding their role in the coming conflict, without need for explanation. It was more than military training. It was the coordination of men who had survived together in the realm of extreme marksmanship. "The town needs to understand what's coming," Anderson advised as they finalized their plans. "Hawthorne won't just be shooting to kill. He'll be trying to create art with each shot, like Wade taught him. Makes him more dangerous, but also more predictable." Davidson agreed, his tactical mind already calculating counters to Hawthorne's likely strategies. "He'll start with impossible shots, trying to break morale, picking off targets at extreme ranges, threading bullets through narrow gaps." The sheriff traced potential firing lines on the map. "That's why every position we've prepared has multiple layers of cover. Let him waste time setting up perfect shots while we prepare practical ones." Samuel Hawkins, examining the modified rifles Davidson had positioned throughout town, noted another level of tactical thinking. "You've got these sighted for specific ranges," he observed, "each one dedicated to a particular field of fire." "Wade taught us to specialize our weapons," Davidson confirmed, "but he meant it for offense. We're turning it around, using precision, to defend rather than destroy." As midnight gave way to the small hours, the veterans' planning grew more detailed. Anderson shared his observations about Hawthorne's recent operations, noting how the outlaw had modified Wade's teachings for his own purposes. "He's developed a signature," the marshal explained. "Likes to announce each shot before he takes it, calling out the range and difficulty. Make a theater of the whole thing." His expression showed professional disgust. Wade would have hated the showmanship, but he'd appreciate the technical skill. Davidson absorbed this information with the calculated precision that had made him legendary. "That vanity gives us an advantage," he noted, marking potential shooter positions on the map. "Man who stops to announce his shots gives his target time to react." The discussion turned to the psychological aspects of the coming confrontation. These men understood that the battle wouldn't just be fought with bullets. It would be a contest of wills between different interpretations of Wade's legacy. "Hawthorne thinks he's proving something," Anderson mused, examining the modifications Davidson had made to his Remington. trying to show he's the true heir to Wade's teachings. But he never understood the most important lesson. Which was? Deputy Harper asked, caught up in the veterans' discussion. Davidson answered, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. That the true measure of a marksman isn't in the shots he takes, but in the ones he chooses not to take. Wade forgot that, turned precision into persecution. He checked his ammunition one final time, each motion deliberate and exact. Tomorrow, Hawthorne learns the difference. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Thunder Valley's defenders had transformed the town into a complex web of calculated firing positions, each one prepared with mathematical precision. But more than that, they had created a trap for men who believed that extreme marksmanship was an art form rather than a solemn responsibility. The coming day would test not just their skill with firearms, but their understanding of what precision really meant. And somewhere out there, perhaps watching from the shadows, Colonel Sebastian Wade would see his teachings turned back upon themselves in ways he had never imagined. The pre-dawn hours brought the first tangible signs of the Crimson Riders' approach. Marshal Anderson, patrolling Thunder Valley's outskirts, spotted signal fires in the distant hills. Not attempts at concealment, but deliberate demonstrations positioned at precisely measured intervals. Sheriff Davidson recognized the pattern immediately. It was straight from Wade's handbook on psychological warfare, a method of showcasing precision even in camp placement. Deputy Harper found Davidson and Anderson studying these distant flames. From the church's bell tower, their expressions grave in the flickering light. The marshal's weathered face showed concern as he gestured toward the southeastern horizon. "They're not hiding their numbers anymore," Anderson observed, counting the fires. "Must be 30 marksmen out there, maybe more. Each one is positioned to cover specific ranges." Davidson's response carried the weight of experience. Hawthorne's following Wade's doctrine to the letter. Display your precision first, make your target understand the artistry before you begin. He's arranging his men like a conductor placing his orchestra. The morning brought more evidence of the gang's methodical approach. 3 prized shooting horses galloped into town, their saddles empty but bearing precise shots through their leather. Each bullet hole a perfect demonstration of skill. Dr. Sullivan, examining the animals, found each bearing identical marks, shots that had passed through the saddles at exactly the same angle, despite being fired from different distances. "He's announcing himself," Davidson explained to the gathered town council, his voice steady despite the implicit threat. "I want us to know exactly what level of marksmanship we're facing." The sheriff's hand rested near his Remington as he continued, "But he's also revealing his state of mind. Wade taught us that a marksman who needs to showcase his skill usually doubts his nerve." Rebecca Cooper's cafe became an impromptu command center as Davidson, Anderson, and selected townsmen refined their defensive strategy. The sheriff's tactical acumen showed clearly now, each instruction reflecting years of experience in precision combat. He positioned shooters with mathematical exactitude, ensuring overlapping fields of fire while identifying potential blind spots in their coverage. "Notice how he thinks in angles," Anderson explained to Deputy Harper as they checked ammunition supplies. "That's Wade's advanced training. Most men think about hitting targets. Thomas thinks about controlling every degree of space between them." The marshal's words carried both admiration and warning. "Hawthorne learned the same lessons, but he never had the patience to master them like your sheriff did." By mid-morning, more signs of the gang's approach emerged. Travelers reported seeing marksmen establishing positions in the surrounding hills, each one meticulously measuring distances and wind patterns while maintaining visible presence. It was a strategy meant to induce panic, to make the town feel like the focus of dozens of precision rifles. But in Thunder Valley, under Davidson's quiet leadership, the response was methodical preparation rather than fear. Dr. Sullivan, organizing medical supplies with help from the town's women, observed how Davidson's influence had transformed the community. Instead of chaos, there was purpose. Rather than panic, there was grim determination. The sheriff had somehow transmitted his own calculating precision to the town's people, turning potential victims into coordinated defenders. A dust-covered rider arrived around noon, bringing intelligence that made Anderson's face darken. "Hawthorne's got a special rifle," the scout reported, describing a custom-made Sharps with elaborate modifications. "Word is, Wade himself built it, designed for shots beyond normal range." This news prompted a swift modification of Davidson's defense plans, though his expression remained unchanged. "Wade always said the perfect shot required the perfect tool," the sheriff remarked, making adjustments to their preparations. "Hawthorne's trying to prove he's worthy of the master's finest weapon. Even if he doesn't know, the master might be watching." The sheriff's calm certainty steadied nerves among those who overheard. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Frederick Morton noticed something that spoke volumes about the approaching confrontation. Davidson had removed his eye patch carefully, placing it in his desk drawer. When questioned, his response was quiet but significant. "What's coming isn't about hiding anymore," he said, the scar tissue around his eye catching the light. "It's about seeing everything clearly, no matter how hard it is to look at." The transformation in Davidson became more pronounced as evening approached. The careful movements of the aging lawman gave way to the fluid precision of a veteran marksman. Even his voice changed, carrying an edge of calculated authority that demanded immediate compliance. Anderson watched this emergence with knowing eyes, recognizing the return of the man he'd known in Virginia. "You've got that same look you had before Spotsylvania," the marshal observed as they made final preparations. The mention of that name caused Davidson to pause, his hand tightening imperceptibly on his Remington. Spotsylvania had been the Shadow Corp's most challenging assignment, a confrontation that had revealed the first signs of Wade's descent into obsession with the perfect shot. "Difference is," Davidson replied, checking his sight alignment with practiced care, "this time we're on the right side of the scope." The statement carried layers of meaning, acknowledging past sins while affirming present purpose. Thunder Valley wasn't just another targeting exercise. It was a chance for redemption. As night fell, the town settled into tense vigilance. The distant fires had multiplied, creating a perfect circle of light that emphasized their isolation. Hawthorne was implementing Wade's siege tactics flawlessly, but he was operating from a flawed assumption. He believed he was hunting an aging sheriff in a vulnerable town. Instead, he was walking into a confrontation with Wade's most accomplished student in a battlefield of that student's choosing. Marshal Anderson, completing his final rounds, found Davidson in the church tower, his attention focused southward, where the gang's fires painted the horizon. "Dawn's going to be interesting," the marshal remarked, the understatement heavy with meaning. Davidson's response was characteristic in its quiet certainty. "Wade taught us all about using first light to maximize shooting conditions." He checked his custom loads one final time. But he never understood that sometimes the perfect shot isn't about the shooter at all. It's about giving your target a chance at justice. "What do you mean?" Anderson asked, though he suspected he knew. "Wade taught us to kill with precision," Davidson explained, his scarred eye catching the firelight. "But he never taught us how to use that precision to protect. That's what Hawthorne's about to learn." In the gathering darkness, Thunder Valley waited. The next sunrise would bring violence on a scale the town had never seen. But under Davidson's guidance, they were as ready as they could be. The legend of Deadeye was about to face its greatest test, and the price of failure would be measured not just in blood, but in the corruption of everything precision shooting was meant to be. James Peters, working late at his forge, noticed something else about Davidson's preparations that spoke to deeper planning. The sheriff had asked him to create special markers, thin metal rods of varying heights that to the untrained eye looked like simple survey stakes. Need them placed just so, Davidson had explained, demonstrating the exact angles required. When the morning sun hits them, they'll cast shadows. Each shadow length means something specific. The blacksmith recognized the methodology. It was a system for measuring distances without obvious markers, the kind of tool only a master marksman would think to create. Samuel Hawkins, examining these preparations, shared his own insights. With Deputy Harper, "Back in the war, we had a saying about the best sharpshooters. They spend 10 times longer preparing than shooting." He gestured to Davidson's meticulous work. "Your sheriff, he's taking that to a whole new level. He's not just measuring distances, he's creating a whole language of angles and shadows." Dr. Sullivan's medical preparations revealed another layer of Davidson's strategic thinking. He had her position her aid stations not just for convenience, but in locations that could be defended from multiple angles. "Every position serves 2 purposes," he explained, showing her the firing lanes he'd calculated. Healing and holding ground. Wade never understood that part, that every position should protect as well as project power. As midnight approached, the town's children, secured in the reinforced church basement, contributed their own observations to the adults' understanding. Young Tommy Cooper described how he'd seen the sheriff spending time with a strange brass instrument earlier in the week, measuring the way light bent through it at different times of day. He said sometimes the best way to understand light is to see how it changes, the boy reported. Said tomorrow morning those changes would matter more than usual. Anderson, overhearing this, nodded in understanding. "He's accounting for light refraction," the marshal explained to those nearby. "Wade taught us about it, but Thomas took it further. He's not just measuring where things are, he's measuring how they'll appear when the shooting starts." The night deepened, and Thunder Valley's transformation reached its final stages. Davidson had turned the entire town into a complex calculation. Every angle and distance measured, every shadow and light pattern understood. But more than that, he had transformed its people. Rebecca Cooper's staff weren't just serving meals. They were maintaining a network of observers. The mine workers weren't just taking shelter, they were manning precisely placed defensive positions. Wade taught us that precision shooting was about imposing your will on the world through perfect shots, Anderson mused, watching the town's preparations. But Thomas understood something deeper, that true precision is about protecting what matters, one calculated action at a time. In the final hours before dawn, Davidson shared one last insight with his closest allies. Gathered in his office, he revealed pages of calculations and diagrams that went beyond simple shooting mathematics. "Hawthorne thinks he's coming to put on a performance," the sheriff explained, his scarred eye catching the lamplight. "Wants to turn death into art like Wade taught him. But he's forgotten the most important lesson of precision, that every calculation has a human cost. Every perfect shot leaves a mark on the shooter as well as the target." The night wind carried the distant sound of the Crimson Riders' preparations. The metallic clicks of rifles being cleaned, the soft whispers of rangers being called out. But Thunder Valley was ready. Davidson had transformed it from a target into a testament to what precision really meant. Not just the ability to take life at extreme ranges, but the skill to preserve it through careful preparation and protective calculation. As the first hints of false dawn began to color the eastern sky, Thunder Valley held its breath. The coming day would test not just their marksmanship, but their understanding of what accuracy truly meant. And somewhere in the darkness, perhaps, watching through his own scope, Colonel Sebastian Wade would see his teachings either vindicated or transformed by the men who had learned them best. The first shot came at precisely 5:47 a.m., just as the eastern sky began to pale. A single rifle crack split the dawn, followed by the musical ping of a bullet striking one of James Peters' metal markers at exactly 1,000 yards. The sound carried a signature that Marshal Anderson recognized immediately: Wade's custom-made Sharp's rifle, announcing its presence with deadly precision. Sheriff Davidson, positioned in the church tower with his Remington, didn't even flinch. "Range-finding shot," he said quietly to Deputy Harper. "Hawthorne's testing his calculations against mine." The sheriff's scarred eye studied the distant hillside through his scope. "He's positioned himself exactly where Wade would have. High ground, eastern approach, sun at his back." The second shot came 30 seconds later, striking another marker with surgical accuracy. This time, Davidson allowed himself a grim smile. "He's shooting the wrong targets," he murmured, reading the signs but missing their meaning. Dr. Sullivan, organizing her medical supplies in the reinforced basement of Cooper's store, heard Anderson explaining the significance to the defenders gathered there. Each of those markers is set at a specific distance, but they're not just range indicators. Thomas has positioned them to create false reference points. Hawthorne thinks he's confirming his calculations, but he's actually calibrating his rifle to the wrong measurements. The true sophistication of Davidson's preparations began to reveal itself as the morning light strengthened. The metal rods Peters had crafted weren't just distance markers. They were part of an elaborate deception. Each one had been placed to account for the curvature of the valley and the morning's atmospheric conditions, creating a subtle distortion in range estimation that only a master marksman would recognize. A third shot rang out, this one accompanied by Hawthorne's voice carried clearly across the morning air. 1,250 yards, he called out, the showman in him unable to resist announcing the feat. "Through the weather vane on the church steeple." The bullet struck exactly where he'd called it, shearing through the metal rooster with surgical precision. But Davidson had been counting on this display of marksmanship. The weather vane had been carefully modified by Peters, its metal composition altered to create a specific sound when struck. A sound that would carry false acoustic information about range and elevation to any experienced marksman. Wade taught us that sound travels differently than bullets, Davidson explained to Harper, who watched in amazement as the sheriff made minute adjustments to his scope without even looking through it. Hawthorne's listening to the impacts, using them to fine-tune his calculations, but he's tuning them wrong. The morning's deadly exhibition continued as the sun climbed higher. The Crimson Riders' best marksmen began to demonstrate their skills, each shot more impressive than the last. They threaded bullets through narrow gaps between buildings, ricocheted shots off multiple surfaces, and placed rounds in precise patterns that spoke to years of practice. But Thunder Valley's defenders held their fire, following Davidson's strict instructions. Each spectacular shot from the attackers revealed more about their positions, their capabilities, and most importantly, their adherence to Wade's doctrine of precision showmanship. "Notice how they're taking turns," Anderson observed to Samuel Hawkins as another bullet struck a distant target. "Each man is trying to outdo the others. Wade always said competition among shooters honed their skills, but Thomas knows something. Wade forgot. Every shot you take to show off is one less shot you have when it really matters." The true test came at 6:23 a.m., when Hawthorne himself decided to demonstrate his mastery of Wade's teachings. His voice rang out across the valley once more, clear and confident. "Witness true artistry, 2,000 yards through the hanging." Lamp in Cooper's window, splitting Davidson's coffee cup without spilling a drop. The shot that followed was a masterpiece of calculation, accounting for wind, elevation, and the refraction of light through the window glass. The bullet passed through the lamp, sending it swinging in a precise arc before striking the cup on Davidson's desk. It was the kind of shot that would become legend among marksmen, but Davidson wasn't at his desk. The coffee cup was a careful replica, placed there as part of his larger strategy. More importantly, the swinging lamp was now sending coded signals to Thunder Valley's defenders, its motion precisely calibrated to indicate wind patterns and atmospheric conditions that Davidson had spent years studying in the valley. "Hawthorne just gave us exactly what we needed," the sheriff explained to Harper, making final adjustments to his scope. "He confirmed every assumption I made about his position, his rifle's capabilities, and his own tendencies. Wade taught us that the perfect shot requires perfect information. What he didn't teach was that sometimes the best information comes from letting your enemy think he's teaching you something." The morning's demonstration reached its crescendo as the sun cleared. The eastern mountains. Hawthorne's voice carried across the valley one final time, full of theatrical grandeur. "For my final exhibit of the morning, the star from Sheriff Davidson's chest at 2,500 yards, let all witness the true mastery of distance and death." The shot that followed was perhaps the finest display of long-range marksmanship many had ever witnessed. The bullet struck the sheriff's star, which had been carefully positioned on the jail's porch railing, with such precision that it rotated 3 times before falling. Davidson watched through his scope as Hawthorne stood on his distant perch, obviously savoring the moment of triumph. The outlaw's stance, his choice of position, even the way he cradled Wade's custom rifle, everything spoke to his complete embrace of their former teacher's philosophy. "Perfect shot," Davidson admitted quietly to Anderson, who had joined him in the church tower. "Absolutely perfect, just like Wade would have demanded." "But," the marshal prompted, recognizing something in his old friend's tone. "But perfect isn't the same as right," Davidson replied, finally raising his own rifle. "Wade taught us to shoot for perfection. Took me years to learn that sometimes you need to shoot for justice instead." The sheriff's first shot of the morning wasn't announced. It carried no theatrical flourish, no called range or dramatic declaration. Instead, it struck Hawthorne's scope mount with mathematical precision, disabling the expensive optics without risking lethal damage. The message was clear. Davidson could have taken the killing shot, but had chosen not to. It was a demonstration, not just of superior skill, but of a different philosophy of precision shooting altogether. Hawthorne's reaction proved he understood the significance. His voice, when it carried across the valley this time, had lost its theatrical quality. "So it is you," he called out, "the one who survived. Wade said you died in Virginia." "Wade was wrong about a lot of things," Davidson responded, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard, including what precision shooting is really for. The real battle for Thunder Valley was about to begin, and both sides now understood it would be fought not just with bullets, but with opposing views of what accuracy and skill truly meant. Hawthorne had learned to shoot for perfection and acclaim. Davidson had learned to shoot for justice and protection. 2 philosophies of precision were about to clash, and the fate of Thunder Valley hung in the balance. From her position in the reinforced basement, Dr. Sullivan observed how the town's defenders reacted to this first exchange. The display of marksmanship from both men had left many in awe, but it was Davidson's deliberate choice not to take a killing shot that truly impressed them. This wasn't just a contest of skill, it was a demonstration of principle. "That's the difference right there," Samuel Hawkins explained to those nearby, his voice carrying the weight of military experience. "Hawthorne shoots to prove he can. Davidson shoots because he must." The old sharpshooter's assessment captured what many were beginning to understand about their sheriff's true nature. James Peters, who had helped create many of Davidson's mechanical preparations, now saw how each piece fit into the larger strategy. The markers weren't just for measuring, he realized aloud. They were teaching tools. Each shot the riders took taught us something about their positions, their timing, their tendencies. Marshal Anderson confirmed this observation. Wade always said knowledge was ammunition. He meant we should gather information to use against our targets. But Thomas turned that lesson around. He's letting them give away their own weaknesses through their desire to demonstrate their skills. The morning's deadly ballet had revealed more than just shooting prowess. Through careful observation, Davidson had compiled a mental catalogue of each marksman's particular style. Every theatrical shot from the Crimson Riders had told him something crucial about their capabilities and limitations. Notice how Hawthorne's third shot landed slightly left of his call? Davidson pointed out to Deputy Harper. That's his tell, always has been. When he's trying to impress, he overcorrects for wind drift. Wade tried to train it out of him, but some habits run too deep. Rebecca Cooper, watching from her carefully reinforced position, noticed something else about the sheriff's strategy. The coffee cup Hawthorne had shot, her best china offered willingly for the deception, had been placed precisely where the morning sun would reflect off its surface. You wanted him to take that shot, she realized. Needed him to prove something. Davidson nodded. Needed to confirm he's still using Wade's old formulas for light refraction. They work perfectly in most conditions, but here in the valley, he gestured to the peculiar way the morning light played through the mountain air. Local conditions require local knowledge. The scientific precision of Davidson's preparations became clearer as the sun rose higher. Each of Peter's metal markers had been calculated not just for distance, but for their interaction with the valley's unique atmospheric conditions. The hanging lamp's swing pattern, carefully calibrated by Davidson himself, was providing crucial data about air density and wind patterns to the experienced defenders. It's like a symphony, Anderson explained to the amazed townspeople. But instead of music, Thomas is conducting calculations. Every piece of information, every measurement, every reaction, they're all notes in a larger composition. The true sophistication of Thunder Valley's defense went beyond mere physical preparations. Davidson had created a mathematical model of the entire valley, one that accounted for variables most marksmen never even considered. The morning's exchange had confirmed his calculations while revealing the limitations of Wade's more theoretical approach. Wade taught us that perfect shooting was about mastering universal principles, Davidson explained to Harper as they adjusted their positions. Took me years to learn that every place has its own rules. Thunder Valley's got patterns, Wade's formulas. Never accounted for. The sheriff's extensive study of local conditions was about to pay off in ways the Crimson Riders couldn't anticipate. Each theatrical shot they had taken, while impressive, had given Davidson more data to refine his understanding of how they interpreted the valley's challenges. As the morning progressed, the defenders began to understand the deeper game being played. This wasn't just about outshooting the Outlaws, it was about using their own precision against them. Davidson had turned Thunder Valley itself into a weapon, one that would punish any shooter who relied too heavily on textbook solutions to local problems. "Remember what Wade used to say?" Anderson asked, watching Davidson make minute adjustments to his rifle. "The perfect shot is a marriage of science and art." But he forgot something crucial. "What's that?" Harper asked, fascinated by this glimpse into the world of elite marksmen. "That sometimes the most precise thing you can do is choose not to shoot at all," Davidson answered, his scarred eye studying the distant hillside where Hawthorne waited. "Wade taught us how to take life with mathematical certainty. Took me losing. An eye to learn how to preserve it with equal precision." The morning's demonstration had set the stage for the true conflict to come. Hawthorne and his Crimson Riders had shown their mastery of Wade's teachings about perfect shooting. Now they would learn that Davidson had taken those same teachings and transformed them into something their old mentor had never imagined. A system not for dealing death, but for defending life with calculated precision. The real assault began. Precisely at 7:15 a.m., when the morning sun had climbed just high enough to create the light conditions Wade had always favored for precision work. Red Hawthorne orchestrated the attack with the same theatrical flair he brought to his shooting, coordinating his marksmen like a conductor leading a deadly orchestra. "Let Thunder Valley witness true mastery," his voice carried across the distance. "Every shot a demonstration, every bullet a lesson in perfection." The first volley came from multiple directions simultaneously, 24 rifles speaking as one. Each shot targeted a specific defensive position with calculated precision. Gun ports, windows, even the narrow gaps between sandbags that Davidson's people had prepared. But Thunder Valley's defenders held their ground, protected by preparations far more sophisticated than the Crimson Riders realized. Davidson had positioned his people behind carefully engineered deflection points, using the valley's unique geometry to create safe zones that appeared exposed to anyone calculating angles from standard shooting positions. "Notice how they're targeting obvious cover," Marshal Anderson observed from his position near the church. "They're shooting by the book, Wade's book." But Thomas wrote a different edition entirely. The sheriff's defensive strategy revealed itself in layers as the battle intensified. Each seemingly vulnerable position actually channeled incoming fire into harmless trajectories. The metal markers that Peters had crafted weren't just for range. They were creating subtle atmospheric disturbances that affected long-range accuracy in ways only Davidson fully understood. "The valley's got its own heartbeat," Davidson explained to Deputy Harper as another volley of shots passed harmlessly through carefully planned gaps. "Air moves differently here than in the textbooks. Wade taught us formulas, but he never taught us to listen to the land itself." Dr. Sullivan, monitoring the situation from her reinforced aid station, noticed something remarkable. Despite the intensity of the Crimson Riders' fire, they had yet to inflict a single serious casualty. Each spectacular shot, while devastating to property, somehow missed the defenders by precise margins. "He's not just protecting us," she realized, watching Davidson direct subtle adjustments to their positions. "He's teaching us. Every near miss is a lesson in where not to be." The sheriff's true mastery became apparent as the morning wore on. He had transformed Thunder Valley's architecture into a complex mathematical equation, one that used the riders' own precision against them. The more accurate their shots, the more predictable their positions became. James Peters, who had helped create many of the defensive preparations, began to understand the deeper strategy. "Each piece of metal I shaped," he explained to those nearby. "It's not just cover, it's like a tuning fork. Every hit tells the sheriff something about the shooter's position, their rifle, even the type of ammunition they're using." Hawthorne's frustration became evident as his men's perfect shots repeatedly failed to achieve their intended effects. His voice carried more edge now as he called out increasingly difficult shots, each one a masterpiece of calculation that somehow fell just short of success. 2,000 yards through the bank's weather vane, ricochet off the water tower into the sheriff's office, he commanded, demonstrating the kind of shot that had made him legendary. The bullet followed exactly the path he called, a testament to incredible skill, but the office was empty, the apparent target of another of Davidson's carefully planned deceptions. "He's still shooting for an audience," Davidson observed Anderson as they monitored the attack. "Still trying to prove himself to Wade's ghost. That's why he can't see what's really happening." The marshal nodded, understanding. "He's playing your game without realizing it. Every perfect shot is just giving you more data." The morning's deadly dance continued as the sun climbed higher. The Crimson Riders demonstrated their mastery of distance and accuracy with every trigger pull, but they were fighting on Davidson's terms without knowing it. Each spectacular shot revealed more about their positions, their capabilities, and most importantly, their limitations. Samuel Hawkins, watching from his assigned position, shared insights with the younger defenders about what they were witnessing. "In the war, "We learned that every shooter's got a pattern," he explained. "Most never notice it themselves, but your sheriff, he reads men's shooting habits like others read tracks." The true sophistication of Davidson's strategy became clear when Hawthorne attempted his most ambitious shot yet. "Witness this," his voice boomed across the valley. 3 targets, 1 bullet, at 2,000 yards. The church bell, the saloon, a door, and the blacksmith's anvil. The shot was a masterpiece of ballistic calculation, the bullets striking each target in perfect succession. But Davidson had been waiting for exactly this display. The specific ring of each impact, the precise way the bullet fragmented. Every detail told him something crucial about Hawthorne's position and state of mind. "That's his signature shot," Davidson explained to Harper. "Same one he used to qualify for Wade's special unit. He can't help but show it off, even though it gives away exactly which rifle he's using and how he's compensating for the valley's crosswinds." The defenders began to understand they were watching more than just a shooting contest. This was a battle of philosophies, fought with bullets and calculated angles. Hawthorne and his men demonstrated their artistry with every shot. But Davidson was showing them a different kind of mastery, the precision of protection. "Wade taught us that perfect shooting was about imposing your will on the world," Anderson reflected, watching another volley of shots pass harmlessly through Davidson's defensive network. "Thomas learned it's about understanding the world well, enough to work with it instead of against it." The morning's combat reached a crucial turning point when one of the Crimson Riders, frustrated by their lack of success, broke from Hawthorne's choreographed performance. He attempted a simpler, more direct shot at what appeared to be an exposed defender. The bullet missed its mark by inches, but more importantly, it revealed the shooter's position to Davidson. The sheriff's response was a single, unannounced shot. The bullet struck the ground exactly 1 foot in front of the impetuous shooter, kicking up dust in a precise pattern that sent a clear message. He could have made the kill shot, but chose not to. "That's not just warning him," Anderson explained to the amazed defenders. "That's teaching him. Thomas just showed him exactly how much he misjudged the valley's wind patterns." Hawthorne's voice carried a new note of uncertainty as he called out his next series of shots. He was beginning to understand that they weren't just facing an old lawman with a badge. They were up against someone who had taken Wade's teachings about precision and evolved them into something entirely new. The morning's demonstration had shifted the balance of power in ways the Crimson Riders were only beginning to grasp. They had come to Thunder Valley expecting to prove their mastery of precision shooting. Instead, they were learning that true accuracy involved more than just hitting targets. It meant understanding the complex mathematics of life and death in ways Wade had never taught them. Rebecca Cooper, watching from her reinforced position, noticed how Davidson used even the town's most mundane features as part of his defensive system. The clothes hanging on washing lines, which the sheriff had insisted remain in place, created subtle movements in the air that only a master marksman would notice. Each fluttering sheet provided crucial information about wind patterns at different elevations. "See how he's reading the laundry," Samuel Hawkins pointed out to Deputy Harper. "Back in the war, we used flags to gauge wind speed, but your sheriffs turned every piece of cloth into a precision instrument. Even the way they're hanging, they're creating specific patterns in the air currents." The sophisticated nature of Davidson's preparations became even clearer when one of Hawthorne's best marksmen attempted a shot that, by all normal calculations, should have been impossible to defend against. The bullet was meant to ricochet off 3 separate surfaces before striking a defender's position, a shot so complex it would have made Wade himself proud. But Davidson had anticipated even this. The surfaces the bullet struck had been subtly altered by James Peters' metalwork, each one creating a specific tone upon impact. To the untrained ear, it was just the sound of bullet meets metal, To Davidson, it was precise data about the shooters, position, elevation, and even the type of powder he was using. Every ping tells a story, Marshal Anderson explained to those nearby. Thomas isn't just hearing shots. He's reading a whole library of information in each sound. That's something Wade never figured out. He was too focused on making noise to listen to what the noise was telling him. Dr. Sullivan, treating a minor graze wound, observed another level of Davidson's strategy. The few injuries they'd sustained weren't random. Each one seemed to serve a purpose, teaching the defenders about safe zones and danger areas without risking serious harm. He's letting us learn from experience, she realized, but controlling the lessons so they don't cost too much. Even our injuries are part of his calculations. The battle's intensity increased as Hawthorne grew more frustrated with their lack of success. He called for a coordinated volley from all his marksmen simultaneously, each targeting a different defensive position. It was the kind of massive display of firepower that had broken other towns' resistance. "Let's see how your geometry handles." "This, Davidson," he shouted across the valley. 25 perfect shots all at once. The volley that followed was spectacular, a symphony of precision shooting that would have devastated any normal defense. But Davidson had prepared for even this. The bullets struck a complex network of deflection points, each impact creating a specific pattern of sound and fury that told him exactly what he needed to know. "Count the shots," he instructed Harper quietly. "Listen to their spacing." 23. The deputy reported after the echoes died away. "Not 25, Davidson nodded. Two of his men hesitated. "They're starting to understand what's really happening here. They're reading the signs, even if Hawthorne isn't." James Peters, who had helped create many of the defensive features, began to recognize patterns in how Davidson used them. The metal wasn't just shaped for strength, he explained to nearby defenders. Each piece has a specific resonance. When a bullet hits it, it sings a particular note. The sheriff can tell exactly where the shot came from just by listening to the tone. The morning sun had climbed higher, changing the light conditions that Wade's formulas relied on. Davidson used this natural shift to further demonstrate the limitations of textbook precision shooting. As shadows shortened and angles changed, the Crimson Riders found their carefully calculated shots becoming less effective. "Wade taught us that perfect light makes perfect shots," Anderson commented, watching another volley fall short. But Thomas learned something more important, that imperfect conditions require perfect understanding. Even the town's children, secured in the reinforced basement, contributed to the defense in ways the attackers couldn't comprehend. Their regular movement between safe zones, carefully choreographed by Davidson, created patterns of shadow and movement that disrupted the riders' ability to establish fixed targeting points. "Every piece moves with purpose," Samuel Hawkins noted, admiringly, like a chess master thinking 10 moves ahead. "The sheriff isn't just defending against their shots. He's making them question every calculation they've ever learned." The true turning point came when Hawthorne attempted his most ambitious display yet. He called for what he called a cascade shot, a single bullet that would trigger a series of precise reactions throughout the town, demonstrating his complete mastery of complex ballistics. "Watch and learn," his voice carried across the valley. "One shot, 7 impacts, each perfectly calculated to create a chain reaction of destruction." The shot itself was a masterpiece of precision shooting. The bullet struck exactly where intended, setting off a spectacular series of secondary impacts that rippled through Thunder Valley. But Davidson had anticipated even this. Each point in the cascade revealed something crucial about Hawthorne's position and technique. "He's shooting like it's still Virginia," Davidson explained to Anderson as they tracked the bullet's path, using formulas that worked perfectly in the Shenandoah Valley. "But Thunder Valley's got its own rules. The air moves different here. The sound travels differently. Every perfect shot he makes just proves how much he doesn't understand where he is. As the morning wore on, the defenders began to grasp the full scope of Davidson's strategy. He hadn't just prepared defenses. He had created a complete system for turning the attackers' own precision against them. Every spectacular shot from the Crimson Riders added to his understanding of their capabilities while revealing nothing about their own. It's like he's turned the whole valley into one big calculation, Deputy Harper marveled, watching another series of perfect shots fail to find their marks. But instead of solving for where to shoot, he's solving for where not to be. The morning's lesson was becoming clear to both sides. Hawthorne and his men had mastered the science of precision shooting as Wade had taught it. But Davidson had evolved beyond mere science into something more profound, an understanding that true precision meant working with the world's complexities rather than trying to overcome them through pure calculation. The battle for Thunder Valley had become more than just a test of marksmanship. It was a demonstration of two opposing philosophies of precision, one that sought to impose perfect shots on an imperfect world, and another that used the world's imperfections to protect and preserve life with mathematical certainty. The turning point in the battle for Thunder Valley came when Red Hawthorne finally understood the true nature of what he was facing. His voice, when it carried across the distance again, had lost its theatrical flourish, replaced by something colder and more calculated. "So that's your game, Thomas," he called out, using Davidson's first name with deliberate intent. Using Wade's teachings to make a mockery of his art. Time to show you what happens when we stop playing by the old man's rules. Marshal Anderson, hearing the change in Hawthorne's tone, recognized the danger immediately. "He's dropping the performance," he warned Davidson. "No more showing off. He's going to fight like he did in the war." The shift in the Crimson Riders' tactics was immediate and dramatic. Gone were the spectacular display shots and cold ranges. Instead, they began a methodical, coordinated assault that spoke to their true capabilities as trained military marksmen. Davidson had been waiting for this moment. "Now we see what Wade really taught them," he told Deputy Harper as they adjusted their positions. "This is how they fought at Spotsylvania. No theater, just pure precision." The new attack pattern focused on systematic elimination of Thunder Valley's defensive advantages. The riders targeted the metal markers and wind indicators that Davidson had so carefully placed, each shot precisely calculated to destroy the town's early warning system. But the sheriff had prepared for even this. "Notice how they're shooting?" he pointed out to Harper. 3-round patterns, standard military grouping. They think they're following battlefield protocol, but they're actually making themselves more predictable. Dr. Sullivan, monitoring the situation from her aid station, observed how Davidson used the riders' new precision against them. Each methodical shot revealed more about their positions than their theatrical displays had, precisely because they were following standard military doctrine. "It's like reading a book you've memorized," Davidson explained when she mentioned this. "Wade taught us all the same patterns. Now they're showing me exactly which page they're on." The sophistication of Davidson's defensive strategy revealed new layers as the battle intensified. James Peters, watching from his reinforced position, noticed how the sheriff used the destroyed markers to create new forms of cover, each broken piece becoming part of a more complex defensive network. "He's not just protecting us," Peters realized aloud. "He's using their own precision to build something they can't see. Every shot they take changes the battlefield, but only the sheriff knows how." Hawthorne's frustration became evident as his methodical assault failed to achieve its objectives. His next radio command to his men carried an edge of desperation. "Concentrate fire on the church tower. Let's see how precise the legend is when his perch comes down." The coordinated barrage that followed was a masterpiece of military shooting. 24 rifles targeted the tower's support points simultaneously, each shot perfectly placed to bring down the structure. But Davidson had anticipated even this. "Count the impacts," he instructed Anderson calmly as they relocated to a prepared position. "Listen to their rhythm." The marshal nodded, understanding. 22 shots. Two men hesitated again. "Same ones as before." "They're starting to see the pattern," Davidson confirmed, beginning to understand what Wade never taught them about the cost of precision. The morning's deadly chess game continued as Hawthorne shifted tactics again, this time attempting to use Davidson's own defensive principles against him. The riders began targeting specific angles and deflection points, trying to create their own network of controlled spaces. But Thunder Valley's architecture, under Davidson's guidance, proved more complex than they had calculated. Each attempt to establish firing lanes was met with subtle countermeasures that the sheriff had spent years perfecting. "Wade taught us that battlefield geometry was absolute," Anderson explained to the defenders near him. "Thomas learned it's more like water. It changes shape depending on how you approach it." The true sophistication of Davidson's preparations became clear when Hawthorne attempted to coordinate a simultaneous attack from multiple elevations. The riders positioned themselves at carefully calculated points around the valley, preparing for a shot pattern that would have made their old teacher proud. "Witness true precision." Hawthorne's voice carried a note of triumph. "Every angle covered, every calculation perfect. This is what Wade's teachings were meant for." But as the riders opened fire, they discovered that Thunder Valley's unique atmospheric conditions had been working against them in ways only Davidson understood. The sheriff had spent years studying how sound and light behaved differently at various points in the valley, creating zones where standard ballistic calculations became unreliable. "They're shooting with Virginia formulas in Montana air," Davidson explained to Harper as another volley fell short. "Wade's equations work perfectly east of the Mississippi. Out here, you need to understand how the mountains change everything." Samuel Hawkins, watching from his position, shared insights with younger defenders about what they were witnessing. "In the war, we learned that every battlefield has its own rules," he explained. "Your sheriff didn't just learn the rules of Thunder Valley, he wrote them." The morning sun had climbed higher, changing the light conditions that Wade's formulas relied on. Davidson used this natural shift to further demonstrate the limitations of textbook precision shooting. As shadows shortened and angles changed, the Crimson Riders found their carefully calculated shots becoming less effective. Dr. Sullivan, treating a minor wound, noticed something remarkable about the few injuries they'd sustained. "These aren't random," she realized, examining the pattern of a graze wound. "Even when their shots hit, they're hitting exactly where the sheriff predicted they would. He's calculated not just where they'll shoot, but how they'll miss." The battle's momentum shifted decisively when one of Hawthorne's best marksmen attempted to outthink Davidson's defense. Rather than following the coordinated attack pattern, he tried to establish his own firing solution based on observed conditions. His shot missed its mark entirely, and Davidson's response was immediate and precise. A single bullet from the sheriff's Remington struck the ground in a precise pattern near the shooter, kicking up dust in a way that any trained marksman would recognize as a message. The man immediately withdrew from his position, understanding that he had just received a lesson in local conditions that no amount of training could have prepared him for. "That's 3 now," Anderson noted, counting the riders who had begun to question their approach. "They're starting to understand what this fight is really about." Davidson nodded agreement. Wade taught them that precision was about mastering universal principles. They're learning that true mastery means understanding that every place, every moment has its own truth. The morning's combat had evolved into something beyond a simple battle of marksmen. It had become a demonstration of 2 fundamentally different approaches to precision. Hawthorne's belief in absolute mathematical principles versus Davidson's understanding of local conditions and adaptive accuracy. As the sun approached its zenith, Thunder Valley stood as a testament to the difference between textbook perfection and practical precision. The Crimson Riders had brought with them every lesson Wade had ever taught about the science of long-range shooting. But they were learning shot by shot that science alone wasn't enough when facing someone who had evolved beyond their teacher's doctrine. James Peters, working from his reinforced position in the smithy, noticed another layer of Davidson's strategy emerging. The sheriff wasn't just defending against the riders' shots. He was using each attack to teach his own people about the valley's unique conditions. "Watch how the dust moves when their bullets hit," Davidson's voice carried to the defenders near him. "That spiral pattern tells you everything about wind conditions at different elevations. Wade taught us to fight the wind. I learned to read its story instead." The transformation in Thunder Valley's defenders became more apparent as the morning wore on. Under Davidson's guidance, even those with minimal shooting experience began to understand the complex mathematics of their environment. They learned to read the subtle signs, how smoke drifted from chimneys, how leaves moved in the trees, how sound echoed off the valley walls. "He's not just protecting the town," Marshal Anderson observed to Deputy Harper. "He's teaching it to protect itself. Every shot the riders take becomes a lesson in survival." Rebecca Cooper, who had initially questioned the wisdom of leaving certain buildings seemingly exposed, now saw the deeper purpose. Each structure Davidson had chosen to sacrifice served as a demonstration point, teaching the defenders about safe zones and danger areas through controlled destruction. "Notice how they're targeting the water tower," Davidson pointed out as another volley struck the structure. "They think they're reducing our resources. Actually, they're showing us exactly how sound travels through the valley's upper air currents." Dr. Sullivan's medical observations added another dimension to understanding Davidson's strategy. The pattern of injuries, though minor, revealed a calculated purpose. Each wound provided specific information about the riders' positions and tactics, while teaching the defenders how to better protect themselves. "In the war," Samuel Hawkins explained to those nearby, "we called it reading the enemy's hand. But your sheriff, he's reading their whole playbook, page by page. Every shot they take is like signing their name to Wade's manual." The psychological impact on the Crimson Riders became more evident as the battle progressed. 3 of Hawthorne's best men had already shown signs of understanding the futility of their approach. Their shots became hesitant, their timing off by crucial fractions of a second. "They're starting to feel it," Anderson noted, his military experience allowing him to read the subtle signs. The doubt that comes when everything you've been taught runs up against something you don't understand. Hawthorne's response to this growing uncertainty was to push his men harder, demanding more precise coordination, more perfect execution. But this only served to demonstrate the limitations of Wade's teaching more clearly. "Form up on 3 levels." His voice carried across the valley. "I want simultaneous fire from every elevation. Show them what real coordination looks like." The attack that followed was mathematically perfect. 30 marksmen firing from carefully calculated positions, at precisely timed intervals. But Davidson had prepared for even this level of coordination. "Listen to their rhythm," he instructed Harper as the shots rang out. "They're firing in standard military cadence. Makes them precise, but it also makes them predictable." Wade never understood that sometimes the most accurate shot is the one that breaks the pattern. James Peters, who had helped create many of the town's defensive features, began to understand the true sophistication of Davidson's preparations. Every piece of metal he had shaped, every angle he had reinforced, was part of a larger mathematical equation that only the sheriff fully comprehended. "It's like he turned the whole valley into one big calculation," Peters marveled. "But instead of solving for where to shoot, he solved for how to survive. The morning's combat had evolved into a complex demonstration of opposing philosophies. The Crimson Riders represented Wade's belief in absolute precision, the idea that perfect shooting could overcome any obstacle through pure mathematical calculation. Davidson's approach showed a deeper understanding, one that recognized the need to work with environmental conditions rather than trying to overcome them. Wade taught us that mastery meant making every shot perfect. Davidson explained to those near him as another coordinated volley failed to find its mark. Took me losing an eye to learn that true mastery means knowing which shots not to take. As noon approached, the battle for Thunder Valley had become more than just a test of marksmanship. It was a lesson in the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom, between the pursuit of perfection and the understanding of purpose. The Crimson Riders had brought Wade's science of precision to the valley. Davidson was teaching them, shot by shot, about the art of protection. The battle for Thunder Valley reached its critical point as the midday sun hung directly overhead, eliminating the shadows that both sides had used for range-finding. Red Hawthorne, his frustration finally boiling over, made a decision that revealed how far he had strayed from Wade's teachings about precision and purpose. "Enough games, Thomas," his voice carried across the valley, stripped of its earlier theatrical quality. "Time to show you what happens when we stop worrying about perfect shots and start taking effective ones." Marshal Anderson, hearing the change in Hawthorne's tone, recognized the dangerous implications immediately. "He's abandoning Wade's doctrine completely," he warned Davidson, about to show us what he learned in the darker days of the war. The shift in the Crimson Riders' tactics was dramatic and immediate. Gone were the calculated single shots and coordinated volleys. Instead, they began laying down overwhelming fields of fire, sacrificing precision for sheer destructive power. Buildings that Davidson had carefully prepared as defensive positions came under sustained attack, but even this development fell within the sheriff's calculations. "Watch how they're shooting now," he instructed Deputy Harper as they moved to a fallback position. "Quick shots, minimal adjustment time. They're fighting their own training, going against everything Wade taught them about patience and precision." Dr. Sullivan, treating a wounded defender, noticed the change in injury patterns. "The wounds are different now," she reported to Davidson. "Less precise, but more numerous. They're trying to overwhelm your defensive geometry with volume." The sheriff nodded, understanding. "Hawthorne's forgotten the most important lesson Wade ever taught us. That desperation makes you predictable. He's showing us exactly what he'll do next." James Peters, whose metalwork had helped create many of Thunder Valley's defensive features, observed how Davidson used this new attack pattern to the town's advantage. Each burst of rapid fire revealed more about the riders' positions than their careful shooting had, precisely because they were abandoning their disciplined training. "Notice the sound patterns," Davidson explained to those nearby. "When they take quick shots, they're falling back on basic military training, standard firing positions, standard spacing. Makes them easier to track, easier to counter." The transformation in the battle became most apparent when Hawthorne ordered his men to target Thunder Valley's civilian buildings, hoping to break the town's morale through indiscriminate destruction. But Davidson had prepared for even this possibility, using the town's architecture itself as part of his defensive strategy. "They think they're being unpredictable," Marshal Anderson observed, watching another volley strike a seemingly vulnerable structure. "Actually, they're following the exact pattern Thomas expected, the same one we saw when outlaw bands would lose discipline under pressure." Rebecca Cooper, whose store had taken several hits, began to understand the deeper purpose behind Davidson's preparations. The buildings that appeared most vulnerable were actually designed to channel the riders' fire away from critical positions, using their own aggression against them. "Every shot they take in anger," Davidson explained as another barrage struck. The town tells us more about their state of mind. Wade taught us that precision requires emotional control. They're showing us they've lost that control. The psychological impact on the Crimson Riders became increasingly evident. More of Hawthorne's men began showing signs of doubt, their rapid fire becoming erratic, their positioning less disciplined. The three who had earlier shown hesitation now actively pulled back from the assault, recognizing the futility of their approach. "They're starting to understand," Samuel Hawkins commented, his military experience allowing him to read the signs. "When you abandon precision for power, you lose both." Hawthorne's response to his men's growing uncertainty revealed how far he had fallen from Wade's teachings. His voice, when it carried across the valley again, held an edge of desperation. That would have shamed their old mentor. "Anyone who holds back gets a bullet of their own," he shouted to his men. "Pour it on. Forget everything Wade taught you about the perfect shot. Just destroy everything you can see." But this desperate command only played further into Davidson's strategy. The sheriff had spent years preparing Thunder Valley not just for precision attacks, but for exactly this kind of unfocused assault. Each defensive position was designed to become more effective as the attackers lost discipline. "Watch how their fire patterns spread out," he instructed Harper, pointing out the tactical shift. "They're covering more ground, but hitting nothing. Vital. Wade always said that when you shoot at everything, you hit nothing that matters." Dr. Sullivan's aid station provided a perfect vantage point to observe the effectiveness of Davidson's defensive design. Despite the increased volume of fire, the number of serious injuries remained minimal. The town's carefully planned architecture channeled the bullets away from populated areas, using the riders' own aggression to create safer zones. "It's like watching a river," James Peters observed, noting how the gunfire flowed around Davidson's defensive positions. "The harder they push, the more the town's design guides their shots away from what's important." The true sophistication of Davidson's strategy became clear as the assault continued. He had prepared Thunder Valley not just for a battle of precision, but for this exact moment when precision would be abandoned. Every building, every angle, every defensive position had been calculated to become more effective against undisciplined fire. "Wade taught us that perfect shooting was about maintaining control," Marshal Anderson explained to the defenders near him. "Thomas learned it was about maintaining purpose. Right now, Hawthorne's men have lost both." The battle reached a crucial turning point when one of the Crimson Riders, frustrated by their lack of success, attempted to rally his companions back to their original training. His voice carried clearly across the valley. "This isn't what we are. We're precision shooters, not common bandits." Hawthorne's response was immediate and brutal. A single shot rang out, and the dissenting rider fell. But this action, meant to reinforce control, only served to demonstrate how completely he had abandoned Wade's principles. "That shot," Davidson noted grimly, "tells us everything we need to know about what's coming next. When a marksman turns his precision against his own men, he's lost more than just discipline." The morning's combat had evolved into something their old mentor could never have predicted. Wade had taught them that precision shooting was about maintaining perfect control in any situation. Now his best students were demonstrating what happened when that control was abandoned in favor of brute force. "They came here to prove they were master marksmen," Davidson explained to Harper as they prepared for Hawthorne's next move. "Now they're proving something else entirely. That precision without purpose becomes just another form of violence." The impact of Hawthorne's brutal display of authority rippled through both sides of the conflict. Among the Crimson Riders, more men began showing signs of internal conflict, their shots becoming increasingly erratic as they struggled between their training and their leaders' demands for destruction. Dr. Sullivan, who had experience treating combat veterans, recognized the signs of psychological breakdown in the attackers' behavior. "It's not just their shooting that's become unpredictable," she observed to Davidson. "Listen to their voices when they call each other. The strain of going against their training is affecting them deeply." James Peters, monitoring from his position, noticed how the changing attack patterns revealed deeper truths about the shooters themselves. "Each man's breaking differently," he explained to those nearby. "Some are shooting too high, fighting, their instinct for precision. Others are shooting too fast, like they're trying to drown out their own thoughts with gunfire." Davidson had anticipated even this psychological aspect of the battle. His defensive preparations weren't just physical. They were designed to exploit the mental strain that would come when highly trained marksmen were forced to abandon their fundamental principles. Wade taught us that a shooter's mind is like a finely tuned instrument, the sheriff explained, as another wild volley struck the town. Force it to play the wrong notes, and eventually it breaks itself apart. Marshal Anderson, watching the deterioration of the Crimson Riders' discipline, shared insights from his own experience. "Saw something similar during the war," he told Deputy Harper. "Elite units forced to fight against their training. It doesn't just break their effectiveness, it breaks their spirit." The transformation in Thunder Valley's defenders stood in stark contrast to the Riders' deterioration. Under Davidson's guidance, they had grown more coordinated as the battle progressed, each man and woman understanding their role in the larger strategy. "Notice how they're moving now," Samuel Hawkins pointed out, observing the defenders' coordinated responses, working together, supporting each other's positions. "While the Riders are falling apart, our people are coming together." Rebecca Cooper, whose store had become a crucial defensive position, recognized how Davidson's preparation went beyond mere tactical planning. "He didn't just teach us where to take cover," she realized. "He taught us why each position matters, how everything connects. We're not just hiding, we're participating in something larger." The sheriff's deeper strategy became apparent as the battle continued. He had designed Thunder Valley's defense not just to withstand attacks, but to become stronger as the attackers lost their precision and control. "Every wild shot they take," Davidson explained, "makes our defensive position more secure. They think they're overwhelming us with volume, but they're actually reinforcing our advantage." Wade taught us that precision was about controlling the battlefield. What he never understood was that sometimes the best control comes from letting your enemy lose their own. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across Thunder Valley as Hawthorne's frustration reached new heights. His next command to his men revealed how completely he had abandoned Wade's teachings about controlled aggression and calculated response. "Burn it!" he shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "Burn everything! Let's see how their precision holds." Up went the whole valleys in flames. But even this desperate tactic played into Davidson's preparations. The sheriff had fireproofed key positions throughout the town, creating a network of safe zones that would become more vital as the attackers resorted to more destructive methods. "He's reading from an old playbook now," Anderson observed grimly. "Same tactics the Raiders used in Kansas. When skill fails, turn to terror." The sophistication of Davidson's defensive strategy revealed new layers as the Crimson Riders began. Their attempts at arson. Each building that caught fire created smoke patterns that the sheriff used to gather more information about wind conditions and enemy positions. "Watch how the smoke moves," he instructed the defenders. "It's telling us everything we need to know about where they'll strike next. Wade taught us to read wind for shooting. I learned to read it to survive." The psychological cost to the Crimson Riders became increasingly evident as more of Hawthorne's men struggled with their leader's orders. The precise marksmen they had trained to be found themselves torn between their ingrained discipline and commands that went against everything they had learned. "Look at their firing patterns now," Samuel Hawkins pointed out to Deputy Harper. "Some are intentionally shooting high, others are delaying their shots. They're fighting themselves more than they're fighting us." Dr. Sullivan's medical observations added another dimension to understanding the battle's progression. "The few wounds we're taking now aren't from skill," she noted. "They're from random chance. These men aren't shooting to hit targets anymore. They're shooting to drown out their own doubts." The afternoon's combat had evolved into a test not just of military skill, but of fundamental principles. Davidson had prepared Thunder Valley to face not just precision attacks, but the chaos that would come when precision failed. Each defensive position, each calculated angle, each prepared fallback point had been designed with the understanding that the greatest threat would come not from perfect shots, but from the desperation of men forced to abandon their training. "Wade taught us that perfect shooting could solve any problem," Davidson reflected as another wave of wildfire struck the town. "He never understood that some problems can't be solved by shooting at all. Sometimes the best defense isn't in how you shoot, but in how you help your enemy lose their way." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Thunder Valley as the battle entered its final phase. Red Hawthorne, watching his carefully constructed assault crumble into chaos, made one last attempt to reassert control over his increasingly fractured force. His voice, when it carried across the distance, held a quality that Marshal Anderson recognized from the darkest days of the war. "Form up!" Hawthorne commanded, his tone carrying an edge of madness. "Everyone who's still loyal to Wade's teachings, prepare for a final demonstration. We'll show them what true mastery looks like, even if we have to shoot through our own men to do it." The threat wasn't idle. Two more of his wavering shooters fell to precisely placed shots from their own leader, each bullet striking with the kind of accuracy that would have made Wade proud, even as the purpose behind them would have sickened him. "He's gone beyond breaking," Anderson observed grimly to Davidson. "This is something else, the kind of precision that comes when a man loses his last grip on humanity." Davidson nodded, understanding. "Wade taught us that perfect shooting required perfect control, never warned us what happens when that control becomes an obsession." The transformation in Hawthorne's remaining loyal men was immediate and chilling. Those who hadn't deserted or fallen to their leader's bullets formed into small teams, abandoning their previous positions for new angles of attack. Their shooting took on a different quality, not the wild suppressing fire of before, but something more calculated and deadly. "Watch how they're moving now," Davidson instructed Deputy Harper as they tracked the new threat. "No more random attacks. They're setting up crossfire patterns, trying to create killing zones we can't defend against." Dr. Sullivan, monitoring from her aid station, noticed the change in casualties. "The wounds are different again," she reported. "Back to precision. Shots, but with a different intent. They're not shooting to demonstrate skill anymore. They're shooting to destroy." The sophistication of Davidson's defensive preparations revealed new layers as this final phase unfolded. He had anticipated even this development, understanding that Hawthorne's descent into madness would eventually circle back to a darker form of precision. "Notice the pattern," he explained to those nearby. "They're targeting points where Wade's formulas say we should be weakest, but those formulas don't account for local conditions, never have." James Peters, whose metalwork had helped create many of Thunder Valley's defenses, observed how the sheriff used this renewed precision against the attackers. "Every shot they take," he noted, "tells us exactly which page of Wade's book they're reading from, and the sheriff's already written corrections in the margins." The afternoon's combat took on a new intensity as Hawthorne coordinated his remaining forces with cold calculation. His voice rang out across the valley, calling shots with mathematical precision that bordered on madness. 2,000 yards. "Western approach, 3-point convergence," he commanded. "Show them how Wade's best students handle complex geometry." The volley that followed was a masterpiece of coordinated shooting, 3 bullets converging on a single point from different angles. But Davidson had prepared for even this level of precision. understanding that Hawthorne would eventually return to the most advanced techniques Wade had taught them. "Count the impacts," he instructed Anderson as the shots rang out. "Listen to their timing." The marshal nodded grimly. 3 shots perfectly spaced. But the sound's wrong. They're compensating for conditions that don't exist. Davidson's deeper strategy became apparent as Hawthorne's renewed precision failed to achieve its intended effects. The sheriff had spent years studying how Thunder Valley's unique conditions affected complex shots, understanding that Wade's advanced formulas would actually become a liability in this environment. "They're fighting the valley instead of working with it," he explained to Harper. "Wade taught us that precision could overcome any obstacle, never understood that sometimes the obstacle is there to teach you a different way." Rebecca Cooper, whose store had become a crucial observation post, noticed how the defenders' response had evolved throughout the battle. Under Davidson's guidance, they had learned to read the attackers' intentions, not just through their shots, but through their positioning and timing. "It's like a language now," she observed. "Every move they make tells us something about what they're thinking, what they're planning." The psychological impact of Hawthorne's leadership became increasingly evident as more of his men struggled with his commands. Even those who remained loyal showed signs of strain, their precision marked by a mechanical quality that spoke of men forcing themselves to overcome their own humanity. "They're not shooting like trained marksmen anymore," Samuel Hawkins noted, his military experience allowing him to read the signs. "They're shooting like machines, following formulas without understanding. That's not precision, that's just mathematics without meaning." Davidson had prepared Thunder Valley for this exact scenario, understanding that the final phase of the battle would be fought not just with bullets, but with opposing philosophies of what precision truly meant. "Wade taught us that perfect shooting was about imposing our will on the world," he explained, as another coordinated volley struck the town's defenses. "Took me years to learn that true precision comes from understanding how to work with the world instead of against it." The afternoon sun caught the metal of Hawthorne's custom rifle as he positioned himself for what he clearly intended to be a decisive demonstration. Wade's prized weapon gleamed like a beacon of the perfection its former owner had pursued so relentlessly. "One last lesson, Thomas," his voice carried across the valley. "Let everyone see what happens when precision serves its true purpose, not protection, but perfect destruction." But even as he spoke, Davidson was making his own preparations. The sheriff's movements were deliberate and measured, each action guided by years of experience and a deeper understanding of what Wade's teachings had really meant. "He's reading from the final chapter," Davidson explained to Anderson, checking his ammunition one last time. "The part where Wade taught us about ultimate precision. But he's forgotten the most important lesson, that no shot, no matter how perfect, is worth the cost of your humanity." The battle for Thunder Valley was approaching its climax, but not in the way Hawthorne had imagined. His pursuit of mathematical perfection had led him back to precision, but a precision emptied of purpose and humanity. Davidson's defense, built on understanding and protection, stood ready to demonstrate a different kind of accuracy, one that valued life over pure mathematics. The transformation in the battlefield became evident as Hawthorne positioned his remaining loyal men. Each took up stations at precisely calculated intervals, creating a network of firing positions that reflected Wade's most advanced theories about coordinated long-range shooting. "Look at how he's placing them," Marshal Anderson observed, his military experience allowing him to read the pattern. "Perfect geometric spacing, exactly like Wade taught us, for maximum coverage. But there's something wrong with it, something almost mechanical." Dr. Sullivan, treating a defender's minor wound, added her own insight. "It's in their movements too. Watch how they respond to his commands. There's no hesitation, but also no humanity, like they've turned themselves into extensions of their rifles. Davidson had anticipated this final evolution of Hawthorne's tactics. His own preparations had accounted for the possibility that their former training would come full circle, returning to precision but without the wisdom to guide it. "Wade taught us formulas for everything," the sheriff explained to Deputy Harper as they adjusted their positions. "Angles, distances, wind corrections, but he never taught us the most important calculation, the human cost of perfect shots." James Peters, whose metalwork throughout the town had helped create Davidson's defensive network, noticed how the sheriff's preparations took on new significance in this final phase. Each piece of metal, each carefully planned angle, served multiple purposes in countering Wade's advanced shooting theories. "It's not just about deflection anymore," Peters realized, watching another coordinated volley strike the town's defenses. The sheriff designed everything to turn their own precision against them. The more perfect their shots, the more predictable they become. The psychological impact of Hawthorne's leadership style became increasingly apparent as the afternoon wore on. Those few men still loyal to him moved with an unnatural synchronization, their actions stripped of individual initiative or human judgment. "I've seen this before," Samuel Hawkins shared with those nearby, his voice heavy with memory. "Back in the war, when men would break under the strain of too much killing. Sometimes they'd become more accurate, more precise, but lose something essential in the process." Rebecca Cooper, observing from her reinforced position, noticed how the very air seemed to change as Hawthorne prepared his final demonstration. The valley's natural sounds, wind in the trees, distant water, scattered birdsong, fell away, leaving only the mechanical clicks of weapons being prepared and the cold calculations being called out. "Range corrections for elevation," Hawthorne's voice carried across the distance. "Adjust for standard atmospheric density. Ignore local conditions. Wade's formulas are absolute." But again, Davidson's understanding of local conditions proved superior to pure mathematics. The bullet passed through the space where Wade's equations said a target should be, but the sheriff had already read the valley's signs and adjusted his position accordingly. Dr. Sullivan, observing from her aid station, recognized the deeper pattern emerging. "Hawthorne's fighting against reality," she noted, "trying to force the world to match his calculations. The sheriff's working with it, letting each moment teach him what he needs to know." The true sophistication of Davidson's strategy became apparent as the duel continued. He wasn't just avoiding Hawthorne's shots. He was using each one to reveal more about his opponent's state of mind. Every perfectly calculated miss told him something about how far Hawthorne had strayed from the true purpose of precision shooting. "Notice how he's moving," Samuel Hawkins pointed out to the defenders near him. "Not just dodging, but reading. Each shot tells him something about where the next one's likely to come from." James Peters, who had helped create many of the town's defensive features, saw how Davidson used even the metal work to his advantage. The precise sounds of bullets striking different surfaces created a complex pattern of acoustic information that only a master marksman could interpret. "He's not just listening to the shots," Peters realized. "He's listening to the valley's response to each impact. That's something Wade never thought to teach." Hawthorne's frustration grew as his theoretically perfect shots continued to miss. Hit their mark. His next volley came with rapid precision, each bullet following flawless trajectories that would have impressed their old mentor, but none finding their intended target. "You're making a mockery of everything Wade taught us," he shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "Precision is about control, about making reality bend to our will." Davidson's response was characteristic in its quiet wisdom. "Wade taught us how to shoot red, but he never taught us how to see. That's something we had to learn for ourselves." The sheriff's first return shot came without warning or announcement. It struck Hawthorne's rifle scope with surgical accuracy, disabling the expensive optics without risking lethal damage. The message was clear. Davidson could have taken the killing shot, but had chosen a different kind of precision. "That's impossible." Hawthorne's voice carried both rage and disbelief. "The wind conditions, the light angle, Wade's formulas say that shots can't be made." "The formulas are tools, not truth," Davidson replied. "The valley tells us what's possible if we learn to listen." The remaining Crimson Riders, watching their leader's perfect calculations fail one after another, began to understand the deeper lesson unfolding before them. 3 more men lowered their weapons, recognizing that they were witnessing not just a shooting contest, but a fundamental revelation about the nature of precision itself. Rebecca Cooper, observing from her position, saw the moment Hawthorne's certainty finally broke. "It's in his eyes," she reported. "He's starting to realize that all his perfect calculations can't account for real life." The afternoon wind shifted again, bringing new patterns of air movement across the valley. Davidson read these changes instinctively, adjusting his position with fluid grace, while Hawthorne struggled to recalculate his shooting solutions. "Wade taught us that wind was an obstacle to be overcome," Anderson explained to those nearby. "Thomas learned it was a partner to be understood. That's the difference we're seeing now." Hawthorne's next shots came with desperate intensity, each mathematically perfect, but increasingly disconnected from the reality of the situation. His voice, when it carried across the valley, had lost its calculated certainty. "You've corrupted everything Wade stood for," he accused. "Turned precision into mere practicality. This isn't what we were meant to be." Davidson's response came not in words, but in action. His next shot struck the ground at Hawthorne's feet, kicking up dust in a precise pattern that any trained marksman would recognize as a final warning. "Look at that dust pattern," Samuel Hawkins pointed out. "Perfect spiral, accounting for every cross-current in the valley. That's not just shooting, that's having a conversation with the wind itself." The final moment came as the sun touched the horizon, changing the light in ways that Wade's formulas had never accounted for. Hawthorne, his perfect calculations, failing him completely, made one last desperate attempt to prove the superiority of pure mathematics over practical wisdom. "For Wade!" he shouted, bringing his rifle up for what he clearly intended to be his masterpiece. "For perfect precision." But Davidson had already read the signs, in the wind, in the light, in the very pulse of Thunder Valley itself. His shot came with quiet certainty, striking Hawthorne's rifle at exactly the point where precision engineering met practical reality. The custom weapon, Wade's pride and legacy, fell from nerveless fingers. The remaining Crimson Riders, seeing their leaders' perfect calculations finally fail, laid down their weapons one by one. They had witnessed something beyond mere marksmanship, a demonstration of what precision truly meant when guided by wisdom rather than pure mathematics. "It's over, Red," Davidson called out, his voice carrying no triumph, only understanding. "Wade taught us how to calculate perfect shots, but he never taught us how to calculate the cost of taking them. In the end, it wasn't superior marksmanship that won the day, but superior understanding." Davidson had shown that true precision wasn't about forcing reality to match theory, but about learning to work with the world as it truly was. Thunder Valley settled into evening quiet, the sun's last rays catching the badge that Davidson had worn so carefully all these years. It wasn't just a symbol of law anymore, but a reminder that some things were more important than perfect shots. Things like wisdom, protection, and the understanding that true precision meant knowing when not to shoot at all. The legend of Deadeye Davidson would grow in the telling, but those who witnessed that final confrontation understood its deeper truth. They had seen more than just a shooting contest between Wade's best students. They had witnessed the difference between precision without purpose and accuracy, guided by wisdom, between perfect calculations and perfect understanding. As night fell over Thunder Valley, peace returned to the town that had learned its own lessons about precision and protection. The sheriff's star caught the last light of day, no longer hiding a legend, but representing something more valuable, the truth that real accuracy came not from perfect formulas, but from perfect harmony with the world around you. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us!